Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Deepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name is Eric Deepen, and I am pastor of the Village Church in Tucson, Arizona. And across from me is Andy Littleton, pastor of Mission in Tucson, Arizona. 9-minute drive, 10-minute drive, 15, depending on traffic.
Somewhere in there. And this is we haven't really laid this out for a few weeks, so I'll just say that this is Faith Over Breakfast. We used to have breakfast together before a radio show. Now we might drink coffee during the time because we decided people don't like hearing us chew. But we have that breakfast table conversation. This isn't something we script. We're working things out together as pastors. There's an empty seat at the table, and you're in it. So it's
literally empty. I'm
pointing at it right now. Yeah, it's a red chair.
Should take a picture so everybody knows where they're sitting.
And today we're launching into a conversation around the new Time magazine article on Elliot Page. So and getting into a lot more. There's the sexuality conversation, but there's also just where is the church coming from? Foundational principles. I think we discovered our next podcast topic, dealing with how does this work out politically. So,
yeah, we're just having fun talking.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. All right. Well, hey.
Hey.
It's Faith Over Breakfast with Eric and Andy. And we haven't actually talked on the mic together in a while. It's been a couple weeks, feels like. I mean, we were in the propaganda interview, but we haven't had just our normal, everyday conversation.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I should say we had kind of we had like a mediated session on accident the other day over real breakfast.
We had a mediated discussion.
Accidentally, we're all at the same breakfast, and we realized we're having one of those like relationship talks.
Yeah.
And to me, I was like, oh, it's like in marriage where it's like, is this about the dishes or is this about something else? And I think that was good.
Yeah. I had a few questions, probably not live on air. To talk to you about. But
sure. but I guess I'm just saying, like, so we haven't been on the mic, but
we've been on the mic.
We've been on the mic.
So much so that John Simon and Rod Hugan, our co-pastors, respectively, suggested that they might have a podcast called Hope After Dinner.
Yes.
That would discuss the Faith Over Breakfast podcast and really see if we were being true to
something.
I don't know what it was. But anyway. Yeah.
And that's such a John Simon thing to come up with.
Hope After Dinner.
But and it's
pretty good.
Yeah, it is. I should say it's not his most clever one, but he'll spit these little things out that you're like, you didn't think about that at all, but that actually could work. Yeah, that's funny.
That's good.
Yeah. Anyway,
maybe I'll steal that from my after dinner conversation. I'll just be like, it's Hope After Dinner with Eric Deepen.
That's right. So I don't know. I assume that this is like, I feel like we just have gone deeper in our relationship.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Whether you feel the same way or not, I don't know.
It's very possible.
Yeah.
It's early in the morning.
It is early. Yeah, and the coffee. I've only had 2 sips of this coffee, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah. We'll see if it kicks in. Mm-hmm. So today, to jump right in, one of the things that I emailed you about was sort of the Time magazine article on now Elliot Page, previously Ellen Page, the star of Juno and numerous other shows. She's on a Netflix show, which I just forgot the name of, but it's about superheroes or whatever.
Right.
But she is a transgender man.
Right.
And it's sort of a conversation with her about that.
Yeah. I mean, actually, even as you're saying this, I think a huge thing going around in culture is trying to figure out what to do with pronouns. Mm-hmm. That's, I think, in the church is, some churches not having this conversation, but I know for sure that if you're in one of those churches that isn't having this conversation, your kids are probably having it.
Yeah,
my kids,
definitely.
My kids in private Christian school with, by and large, conservative families, and I know the kids inside the school are having the
conversation, yes,
and trying to figure this out, and having students who are identifying in different ways. And the truth is that your kids are out there on media, right, to some degree.
And people who are listening to this may be in that process of trying to figure out their pronouns.
Oh, sure. Yep. And so I was just going to say, like, you're referring to her as she just now,
but
would violate what the article said that
yeah,
she would prefer, and wanting to be he, him, they, them. So this is a new complex thing to work through as Christians, and I want to clarify that, like, as that's what we are. So we're coming at it from that angle. What do we do with that?
Well, let's start with the first thing that I noticed in that article. It kind of struck me was that they took the two generations, and you know how much I love talking about generations, but they were talking about the boomers, who was like 0.02% of people who are basically in their 50s and 60s are people reporting as transgender, whereas in the Generation Z, it's up to 1.8%, which is a huge shift. It may not sound like it, but that's a big shift over just, a couple generations.
Right.
And so it's something people are talking about and understanding and wrestling with. And it's all over the schools and
and
media.
Frankly, and in celebrity culture. And I mean, it's almost like, what am I trying to say? It's almost, I think for younger folks, if you don't examine your gender identity now, you're like not part of the movement. You're not part of what's going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which is an interesting, very different thing. In the past, when I was in high school, of course, if you did, you were out of all movements. I mean, I remember a couple of classmates who were dealing with that, right? And that was immediately, you're an outcast of some form. Right. Now it feels almost exactly switched. That if you were to say, I don't think that is how it works, or if you were to say something like, I'm uncomfortable with this, or I don't understand, or any of those things, it would be, you might be kind of outside now. Right. Which is very different.
Right. So the question really comes down to, how do we get to a place in our culture where we understand ourselves this way? Where we are talking about how we feel inside determines our gender identity and who we are as a person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
right. Because, having same-sex attraction, living in those lifestyles has existed since biblical times, but it didn't really define your gender in the sense of changing yourself into something else. You were just a particular gender that
had feelings and desires, right? Right.
And so how do we make this shift? Like what's happening, and how do we as a church and community, both inside and outside of the church, deal with this, engage with this?
Yeah, it's an interesting, there's another complexity to it that I'm thinking about when it comes to culture, and that's that I do think that we are, there's a lot that needs to be examined here. And I think so we're very quick to say something like, there isn't, there's not the binary here of male, female, I'm saying within the culture. But then you move this over into another conversation such as race, in which there really isn't just this clear, binary in race. It's a much more like complicated, and there probably is a more solid argument for it being more of a constructed idea than an actual, built-in. I would argue that there's a little bit of both. I think there's a diversity created by God. But you don't just get to pick your race in our culture today. That has been attempted and strongly denounced.
Right. So I can't just choose to be an African American.
You can't say, I feel black, I'm black.
Right.
That is like, no, you're not, because you don't have experiences that you haven't lived this life. You can't just feel like it. So it's an interesting, so then it begins asking, so on what principles are things defined, and when do you get to go with your feelings and when don't you? I think it's way more complex. And yeah, that's just I feel like as a culture, we have a lot of work it's not so simple.
No,
it's not so simple.
And yet it's the gender thing is pervasive, in, education, and
yes, right.
It's pervasive now. And as you said, in Hollywood, and so it
feels unquestionable.
Right. So we have to have the conversations. And how do we, as followers of Jesus, love and care for those inside who are struggling with those identities? And then how do we bring the gospel to those who are wrestling with this? Because it's a new challenge.
It is.
Like so when Jesus came and he stepped into his community, he's speaking to Jewish people. So he has a culture to culture. Like there's no shift there. Mm-hmm. Then when Paul comes, he has to speak to the Greek culture. So he begins to try to tailor his message for them to understand, and to tailor it to the church that lives within a very hedonistic culture. Right? He's trying to develop a holy temple people inside a very unholy culture and help them see how to invite people into that.
And there's an interesting, now many scholars would disagree with this, but some wouldn't. There's a lot of debate as to who wrote Hebrews, right? I remember I took a class on canons and texts from Phoenix Seminary, and in that class there was an interesting piece in that Hebrews was normally kept in the early codices along with Paul's letters.
Right.
And so there is an argument for it being Paul's letter. And if it is, so there's a part of me that as a person who's written things, I go, you do write different to different audiences.
Right.
And that's part of the argument that it can't be Paul's is how different it is. But then you think, well, what if Paul, who is very educated as a Jewish Pharisee, were writing directly at Jewish people, right, and then elsewhere he wrote differently? Whatever it is, there's a different conversation you have,
right,
depending on who you're talking to, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so Paul exhibits that in Acts and his letters, and there's a chance that's what we see in Hebrews, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's being able to be conversant both with your own community in this process and conversant with people who are not going to be operating from the same foundation as you are.
Yes. Yep. And to do that, you need to understand the foundation and where one might start to build, to move people to see Christ and believe in the God of the Scriptures. And so, so there's an approach in there. There's probably some, that's kind of getting on approach. Then there's how should the Christian think about this? There's probably, and then an approach, knowing who you're talking to. So how do we engage?
So let's just kind of work with this a little bit, because this had nothing to do with research on this particular podcast, but I was looking for some research that I had lost, and so I had to go find it, and I stumbled across the United Methodists, for lack of a better word, hermeneutic to defend gay marriage, basically. And so
this is when the United Methodists have undergone quite a split of their own, and it had to do with especially the Anglo-Western church's desire to affirm homosexuality, and the Southern Black and Latino church did not approve, which was another interesting moment of okay, so who do we? What? It's an interesting moment of going like, so we're trying to do equality here, and all of a sudden the part of the world that is of color, who the United States is trying to figure out how to listen to, is saying no, and the folks in the United States are like, you can't say no to this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You don't get to, which, Yeah, we could go into that.
That's a whole nother deal.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not, it just goes back to some colonization issues.
Yes.
It's interesting now. They're just on a different aspects. But so the UMC, like they have their first one, you and I would agree with. The Bible has timeless truths. Like all time, all space, truth.
Interestingly, a new one, has timeless truths.
Right. We would say is all, but we can agree that there are timeless truths. Like, so the second one is that there are specific truths to specific times. So they only apply to a period of time.
And interestingly, there would be, here's how I would say it, and here's how I think a lot of theologians would say it, is God's revelation might be progressive in that he didn't just, right when Adam and Eve fell, go, Jesus Christ is here.
Right.
So it's progressive in that they're taught and trained, and it builds, but there is still continuity.
Certainly. And then you and I, because I know lots of your positions, would argue from certain parts of texts within the New Testament have some time-specific edicts that don't work in modern times, and we could talk about those, or they're confusing, and we're still trying to figure out what they mean.
And there's a great question to ask is, how would that particular idea work out in our day?
Yeah.
Not like the idea isn't important,
Right.
but is it the exact same application? A very popular one would be head coverings in Timothy. So does
or Corinthians, but yeah.
Okay.
I think they're head coverings.
I thought he was. You're probably right. But I was thinking that. Oh, Paul's instructing Timothy that women shouldn't speak.
Yes.
That's the one I'm thinking.
Yeah.
So these things, like, would it mean the same thing today if a woman put on a head covering, and if it doesn't, then would you still apply the same rule?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and working. So yes, that's what they were meaning, I think, too, by that. So the third one is where you and I would. So there are truths, quote unquote, that are in the Bible that God did not intend to be in the Bible. Mm-hmm. Like they're not true. They're truths in the sense that you read it.
They were actually written there,
but they are not what God intends.
Right.
And so that's how they then make. So that's their hermeneutic. So that's how they approach the Bible, and that's how they have chosen to dialogue with the culture,
or at least a group of
them.
Probably the academic wing of the United Methodist Church
has decided to dialogue with the culture and to dialogue internally. Mm-hmm. Right. So they've decided to have a universal foundation for dialogue. Mm-hmm. So you and I would not move in that direction.
Yeah, I would. No, I mean that would be, and for me that would be foundational. There are disciplines of biblical theology, of systematic theology. This would be a systematic theology moment for me, where I would say the beliefs that I have accepted about God include that He is sovereign and working things out to the point to where He stewards the Bible, his written word, appropriately.
Yeah. And that's where you and I would start from.
Yeah.
And so that's all nice. But let's just talk about coming from that position. Reading the article, Elliot Page talks a lot about just the story of pain, basically, of not ever fitting in her body. Right. And her would be the beginning, and he is now. But like that. And so.
And there were a lot of there was the body, but specific. There was a lot about hair and clothing.
Hair and clothing, yeah. How he was uncomfortable in the clothing.
Which is an interesting piece for me, because I do, when I start to wonder about this, I say, how much of our definition today of male and female have to do with things like specific behaviors and hair and clothing that really aren't necessarily as biblical.
Right.
Like maybe the definitions of male and female we're working on are kind of are socially constructed in that regard.
Yes. And so some of what Elliot Page kind of struggled with is sort of some of the cultural demands of being a girl or being a
You got to
boy.
be girly.
Yes.
Which I've heard this from, for years and years from many folks. There's somebody close to me grew up, always was kind of, wasn't ever really this tough person, was always very creative as a male, and never decided to change gender identity. That wasn't the thing of the day, but was very much outcast from among the men.
Right.
Is that right? Is there anything unmasculine about being creative and musical? Sounds like King David.
Yeah.
Right? To me. So there's some interesting sides of our culture's
Understanding of what it means to be male and female
versus what God has said, which I think we Christians have a lot more work to do.
Yeah.
Many people have done work on this.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's interesting to me is in reading the article about Elliot Page, there's this it's all, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's all, or maybe I do, it's all about her, and it's all about, or him, and it's about what they feel and like fulfillment in life internally, and
which is the going thing to do.
Right.
But yes, it's pervasive. It's when you read it, it's just, wow, this is egocentric.
Yeah, but the thing is, you and I buy into this. Like, if I ask you, like, are you fulfilled in your job? Your answer is probably not going to be to me, yeah, because it provides for my family.
Right. I do. There is a part which is probably living out of the cultural soup.
Yeah.
That is within me that goes, I want to like things and be fulfilled personally. Sure.
Well, we talk about in the church, we talk about fulfilled marriages, like a fulfilling marriage, or like it is about, like, we've really lifted how I experience my marriage, my job, my church.
Yes.
Like these are the like number one things.
Yeah. I think a key thing to throw in the mix here is, for the sake of humility, is to say that the church has bought this hook, line, and sinker, you and me too, for a long time. And so to now criticize it as if we hadn't is going to sound very hypocritical. So we can't do that. And so, it's this basic idea, and it's what we've promised people in evangelism for years and years. Come and believe in Jesus, and he will make you the happiest version of you that you ever could be. All those things that you think are missing, you'll get them now. And we wouldn't quite say it that way, but really, when you dial down on it, it would be you'll find fulfillment in life. You'll find inner peace. You'll find all these things. And some people have become, or they signed the contract or whatever, and then they went, I'm not getting that, and they've left. Other people have dug deeper and asked the question of, what does it mean for, like, Simon Peter he in a sense becomes this man he never was because of Jesus, but also his life is cut short and people turn on him and he lives an uncomfortable existence the rest of his life. It doesn't, and Paul seems to speak very clearly about that he's tried and buffeted and beat down and rejected way more than he ever was before. Right. But then he has this contentment that transcends sense and understanding. So there's this, I don't think it's one or the other, but we've often cast it as if, do the marriage seminar, you'll get a good marriage. Do this, you'll get these good things. You'll get what you want. You'll become who you want to be, which is exactly what Elliot Page is saying.
Yeah, and I think, if we just talk internally, as a church and a community, that I'm not against therapeutic things. I'm not against having a fulfilling marriage, not you having a fulfilling job. I'm not against those things. But when they take primacy over my identity in Christ and the mission of Christ and the calling of Christ, then it's not Christianity. It's not following Jesus. It's like therapeutic happiness with a little Jesus principles attached to it. So it's not about submission. So even with our identity, like, I think that's why the Galatians passage about there not being, Greek, Jew or Gentile, rich or poor, basically, or slave or free, and male or female is not because there isn't distinction in identities, but because they're secondary to our primary identity in Christ, which is a powerful, powerful thing that I think it's written off really easy when, especially in the world where they say, oh, well, the church says you either have to be celibate if you have same-sex attraction, or you're just going to go, or you're in sin and you're rejected, right? Like you don't get, those are your two options. And that's just, they never offered a third, that there is a deeply fulfilling life in Christ and in obedience to Christ. And those things are secondary.
I was just reading up on Henry Nouwen. I was considering his final 10 years in the L'Arche community. It was a sermon illustration. But interestingly, most people believe at this point that he was same-sex attracted but celibate priest.
Right.
And he did seem to hold on to his vows. And there's been a lot of conjecture that people have actually said that they think he may have died because he didn't get his sexual fulfillment. And that's not what
I've read a lot of Henry Nouwen, and I've never heard that.
No, I'm saying, that's not what he says.
Right.
He seemed to suggest that the life he was choosing, and he continued to, the interesting thing is that last 10 years, I read his diary, his Genesee diary, when I went up to that monastery, and he was challenged by one of the monks that his writing and speaking was too core to his identity, and he would get too upset about it, and he obsessed over it. And so when he goes to L'Arche and generally stops doing most of that, I believe he was leaning into that belief that Christ was what he needed, not his identity-giving things.
Right.
And my assumption from that would be that he had a similar conversation around his feelings of sexuality, that he was anchoring his soul in Christ as opposed to these things. And is that a real struggle? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that the cultural read on it now is, you can get the sense that some folks are saying he would have lived a longer, happier life if he just
given into the things that he is,
and like lived out of who he felt he was.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that if he were here, he would say, no, I actively chose the opposite.
Right.
Those things were eating me from the inside, and I needed Christ more.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting case study in it. We can't talk to him. He has died.
Yeah.
But
what would you, so, and maybe we can both kind of answer this question, but if we had to sit down, we got to sit down with Elliot Page, and he was like, you can ask me any question you want. But let's have a dialogue. I'm not going to be offended by anything you say. Like, what kinds of things would you want to discuss with him? Like, how would you want to engage in that?
Well, I think I would hope that in an introductory conversation, didn't spend a whole lot of time just on male, female.
No, right.
And I think that's probably where the conversation usually begins and ends, right? I would like to know a lot more about this journey, and like what are the core things that you believe you need and you are, and that anyone needs. Asking questions about. I mean, I'd just be trying to get at a lower level, deeper principles and hopes and fears. That's what I'd be curious about.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that with our friends or his friends, Elliot probably doesn't have a lot of these conversations. Maybe they do. I think for me, I mean, I have had a number of gay friends or gay acquaintances or people I've sat with, and my experience, and I would confess, has some to do with my own issues, but in that area, but some of it's like, it seems to all of a sudden like move from just this person being a person in front of me to their identity, gender-wise, being always in the forefront.
Sure. Yeah.
I
mean, and that's in a way unfortunate in a way, it's kind of being put in the forefront.
Yeah.
So it's like hard not to face it. Yeah.
And that's so. It seems like it is part of the conversation in a way that's different than like my gender is in the part of the conversation. I mean, I suspect my gender could be part of the conversation in sort of the patriarchy and white maleness. I mean, we could have that conversation that my gender is in that place, but it seemed, it just in normal conversation. And so it's weird. It's like, okay, because we have that, and I can have relationship, and we can have conversation, and we could, but politically now, then it moves. The other reason that it's in the forefront is it's part of politics.
Yeah.
And so that's another, and this is actually,
there's now like rules and laws and freedoms on the
right,
like that are up for debate, and it becomes more complicated.
Right.
And an interesting, sorry, just to pitch this in really quick. When I went to a Cubs spring training game, and and I found a ticket on Craigslist, and there was always pods of multiple tickets. So I found somebody that had two, and sat with this guy who was just a Cubs fan, and we talked Cubs for about an hour before he mentioned that he had a husband, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there were a couple things going on. One, we're there to watch the Cubs. That's what we were doing, I actually had a really great time, and he at the end said he was like you were great. I didn't know who I was going to have to sit next to, but easy to talk to. Thanks so much, And it was like I actually felt the same way. I was like, yeah, I was wondering if it was going to be this awkward person I had to sit next to.
Right.
This guy had all kinds of great information on the Cubs, and it was fun, and loved Andre Dawson, and we went on and on. But the gender thing was not in the forefront.
Right.
Of either of our minds, I don't think.
Right.
We had something else to talk about, and then when it came up, there's this choice you have, like, am I going to make this, this big thing right now? And for me, it was, in that moment, it's like, no, I'm just going to watch this game with this person, and that's fine. But I don't know. It was just an interesting case study of not being presented with the gender question and just being able to have relationship over something else. Right. Yeah.
And that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think they made a comment in the article about how, so he's transitioned from Ellen, I believe that was the name, to Elliot. So female to male. And they were saying that more attention has been paid to the other transition. So male to female.
Right.
And I wonder.
Oh, right.
And they were making the argument that we as a culture, because it's more male driven, are obsessed with female like bodies, and we're obsessed with that. So that's why I think it was kind of the argument they're making.
Yeah, I don't know about their argument, but I have a guess, because there are some more fears around safety and equality.
They did mention that.
Yeah. And so that's because there's such a distrust of males around females in general. When a male says, I'm transitioning and I'm going to be in that bathroom or in that gym room,
or competing in that sport,
and that's the equality one,
right?
Like, there's been such a fight for years and years, and this brings in J.K. Rowling, as mentioned in the article, in a very negative light.
Yeah,
but her discussion about what does this do to feminism in a way, like, and there, that is complex. I mean, I don't think it's as simple as to say just, oh, those things are illegitimate, because, I mean, listen, I have a teenage daughter. If a male was like, I'm transitioning and I want to move into this like space with your daughter in the gym, I really do, like, I have concerns around that,
right.
and that's like, there's this culturally hard thing to say, because like, oh no, it's going to be unbigoted. But I don't have total trust of men who are even like grappling with sexuality in general being in that space.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, and it seems like for some reason we can't, in new buildings or in our building codes, say, okay, well now, because we have multiple genders, we have male and female, which are the dominant genders, and then we have these transition genders, and they can be in their own bathroom.
Right.
Because they're different than male and female.
Right.
So,
I mean, there are those. It's funny because a lot of places have the family bathroom, which
Yes.
is like but it's also like you get this idea like this is built for people to change their baby and maybe have a conversation at the same time. I don't know.
yeah, it's a big square.
They're usually
yeah.
big. It's
Yeah.
I always imagine like, is one of you using the toilet and the other is this? This is an interesting scenario.
Yeah,
But
totally.
but that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, as honestly, like the easiest situation is you go into the place where there's just two bathrooms and they aren't men or women's,
Right.
and I honestly that doesn't bother me.
No, it doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but there are situations, and I get when and the equality thing. It's like, so an athlete that has a male body, like that's an interesting
Right.
thing to compete against. There's a reason that
Right.
men and women don't wrestle each other right now, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Or are not in mixed martial arts together.
Right. Yeah. And it's not just because of bigotry.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was once to make a pathway for females to compete doing the same thing without facing injury
Right.
or just an unfair situation. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that I think there's this impulse, especially when we step into the world in particular, or when we see someone come in who is in these transitions or believes that they're gay or whatever those things are, that we want to correct that right away.
Right away.
We want to fix
Yeah.
that. We want to make sure that they understand where we come from.
Here's the biblical stance, and
Right.
there's no room for that view.
Yeah. And it seems like we have to figure out how to engage in love and trust God and be okay with the water being a little murky while we're figuring that out.
Kind of like with all the other sins.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And just engaging and
Yeah.
trust that God will begin the process of convicting. I know in our community, when this question has come up, what we have concluded is, because people have come into our community, and I suspect into yours because of the types of churches we have that who are openly gay.
Yep.
And the conversation usually for us is, okay, no one is coming to the village in particular to say, hey, this is my identity and I demand that you all accept it.
Right.
They're not gonna because nobody gets to say that at the
Right.
village. Right. So they're not going to come because of that. So they're coming because they want to know faith and they want to figure things out.
Mm-hmm.
So meeting Jesus and allowing the Spirit of truth to begin to work in their hearts and allowing the community to push in and for them to push in into other people's lives and other people's sin, we will trust that God will bring them to that place if they're truly on that journey. If they're like, I am moving towards Christ. Okay.
Right.
We can be in that journey with you then, because we all are in there
Yeah.
doing that. So I think for us, at least at the village, it's like, okay, we'll walk with you wherever you're at, and we'll just all kind of bumble along in that direction.
But we are trying to walk toward and follow Jesus,
Right.
and that's going to be hard for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's going to mean that everybody gets asked how your sexuality is honoring God.
Mm-hmm.
And we just all have to grapple with that together
Right.
and what the scriptures say about it.
Yeah.
And so that's and I know that's the same at Mission. It's the conversation that kind of gets me is in the public square. How do I, when faced with this conversation, when people ask me what I think, because I'm a pastor, so I'm careful not to tell people early on that I'm a pastor. I'm lucky I don't look like one, so people. But when it comes out,
So you don't just put a brick wall up in front
right?
of
They
you, which
want
is what happens.
They want to know what I believe about things. I will quickly get those. What do I believe about this? What do I believe about that?
Yep.
And a friendship can, a developing friendship can quickly move to an interrogation.
Oh, yeah.
And because they believe that I have certain judgments.
You're getting screened.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I've struggled to figure out what that conversation looks like. I do feel that as I've been reading the book of Acts and as I listen to Paul, I'm like, there's love, there's conversation, but there's boldness. And I need to learn how to be gentle and bold. Those are trying to figure out how to be those two in a conversation.
Oh, I I resonate with that, and not just in this conversation, but in many.
Yeah.
Like I've said to people in my community, I feel like a real, it seems like sometimes when I've, in the past at least, and maybe still today, when I feel like I should be bold, it's the time I should be gentle, and the time when I feel like I should kind of pull back is when I should be bold. And learning to be bold in the right moments for the right reasons, and gentle for the right moment, in the right moments for the right reasons, is like an art that I have a long way to go in. But I think it's really important because you do need both.
Yeah.
I remember, and maybe I've shared this with you here before, but there was this was actually a liturgist podcast quite a while ago, but there was a guy who was LGBT affirming in the church, and I was kind of curious about how they worked that out. But one thing he said that I thought was very interesting and very helpful is he said, look, the vague situation where you say things like everybody is accepted, but then they assume when you say accepted, that means they can fully live this lifestyle. It's way worse when they come in hearing, come to Jesus just as you are with no qualifiers, and then they find out, but you can't live the lifestyle here, you can't get married here, you can't be in ministry here. That's way more frustrating and feels like a bait and switch than if you just said up front, here's our views on marriage and sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
He was like, I would much rather you just were honest. And he said, I understand the position that says that Scripture says that this is against the norm. And he kind of was in the UMC boat. He's like, I just think Scripture's wrong about that. He said, but I understand that if you don't think that way, that's what you would conclude, and that's a respectable position. So just stick with it and be honest about it.
Right.
But you don't have to be a jerk. And I remember I was going, that actually sounds about right.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And I think the big struggle in like, that's beautiful, and I think that's where we have to stand. The big struggle for me is, what are the implications in the public square politically? Like, do I want to apply my morality or what I believe to be moral universally? So am I going to fight for marriage as an establishment between man and woman within the church, or I mean within in the United States? Or am I mean, it's a bygone fight now, but am I, in the sense that it's
at the moment? Yeah.
So how do I deal with, do I believe that same-sex couples can adopt? How do I, all of a sudden, I'm forced into all these political positions that I have to have statements about, it feels like, or belief systems on.
And that comes down to, this is another podcast on just the church and its political theory, because the traditions that we come from and relate to the most are a little unique in this regard.
Right.
I think really rich, but they're not the ones that people are used to in America right now.
Right.
Because the church's relationship to the state in the era of the gospel and under Christ is really important. That's working that out is kind of foundational to deciding those types of things.
Yes.
And you can't, and if you haven't worked that out, which I've noticed most people have not, then you're out there making moves that you may not be able to really justify if somebody drills down. Because you'll say the church, the state can't say anything to the church, but you think the church can say things to the state. And people are going to go, well, what's up with that? We can't, the state can't tell you to wear a mask, but you can yell and scream and fight and say the state is dishonoring God when it does something else.
Right.
So do you think you have a one-way relationship? Like the church rules the state? Wow, that sounds like what your Reformation tried to tear down.
Right.
Do you know your history? It starts to bring up stuff like that. And so that would be an interesting
It'd be an interesting conversation, because the other element in all this is, you and I mean, for the last 200 years, the church has existed in a world that it's never, ever existed in the 2,000 years of its history, which is you and I, as an individual, must figure out what we think as a citizen with a vote.
Yeah.
And it's different than like the Greek vote.
Mm-hmm.
This is a whole different concept. Like, I am a government of one at some level.
And then we're really frustrated when we realize it doesn't quite work that way as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
when you're like, wait, there's the votes get turned into delegates?
Right.
Like, what? So my individual vote may not actually run all the way up to determining whether or not the president is.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So it's a different era to ask what it means to be the church, and I think we haven't figured that out yet, and we're going to have to do more work on that.
Well,
and
we should do some conversations about that, because that's foundational to some of the divides.
Yeah, let's talk about that next week.
Sounds good.
You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.